Isn't it a coincidence that in the hospital, there was Mr. Ruby again? How comes he appears over and over everywhere? Now, let's look at some other ideas here that I have that I want to talk to you very quickly about. If you were going to pick somebody, in this case, to set up, who would you pick? Would you pick somebody who was poor and lowly, somebody who couldn't defend himself, somebody who had already set himself up? Would you do that? Let's ask some other questions. If you were going to kill the president and you wanted to escape, would you take 3 seconds or 1 second to pick up the 3 shells and leave? Was that what you would do? Or would you just leave them there so they could now tie them into the gun? With respect to the hiding of the gun, would you have figured out some place to hide the gun, or would you just leave it out there almost in plain sight? Would you have shot the president from the place where you work? I mean, if you're going to shoot somebody, do you go down and plan the shooting so that you do it from your work and you don't have an escape? You can't drive a car? There's nobody to take you out of there? Is that what you would do? Or was he, as he said, a patsy? And so, where is the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald was even there at the bookstore on the 6th floor when the president was shot? Much less that he was involved knowingly in any conspiracy to kill our beloved president. Where is the evidence? And so, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I give you and place into your hands the history of this country and the case of Lee Harvey Oswald. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spence. Mr. Bugliosi, you may proceed, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, defense counsel, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, based on the evidence in this case, Lee Harvey Oswald is as guilty as sin, and there's nothing that Mr. Spence can do about it. I have yet to see the man who can convince 12 reasonable men and women, as you folks are, that black is white and white is black. Mr. Spence, in his argument to you, no more desired to look at the evidence in this case than one would have a desire to look directly into the noonday sun. And I can't really blame him, because if I were he, I wouldn't want to either. Because there's not one tiny grain of evidence, not one microscopic speck of evidence that anyone other than Lee Harvey Oswald was responsible for the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Mr. Spence did say this. It was kind of a subtle, very clever argument. Took me a while to grasp exactly what he was doing. I think he said this, and if I misrepresent you, sir, I'm sorry, but I think he said that Lee Harvey Oswald was the exact type of person to set up as a patsy, or worse to that effect. I'm just paraphrasing him. A Marxist, a defector to Soviet Russia. Actually, he was the exact type of person to murder the president. And my colleague very cleverly turned it around and said he's the exact type of person that makes a patsy. Let's take a look at Oswald. Can anyone fail to see how utterly and completely crazy this man here was? Utterly and completely nuts, bonkers. One example among many. And you have to be bonkers to commit a presidential murder. You've got to be crazy, nuts. One example among many. How many Americans, how many people anywhere in the world defect to the Soviet Union? That alone shows how completely and utterly mentally unhinged this man was. Again, the exact type of person to kill the president. Though he may or may not have had any personal dislike for Kennedy. We don't know that. For all we know, maybe he didn't think Kennedy was that bad a person. Everything is relative in life. However, I think one thing is pretty obvious. Kennedy almost undoubtedly would have represented to Oswald the ultimate quintessential representative. That's the key word, representative, of a society for which he had a grinding contempt. On the issue of conspiracy, Mr. Spence, I'm paraphrasing him. He certainly didn't say who specifically murdered the president, but he certainly implied to you that it was some nebulous, some powerful group. He never put the hat on anyone. He kept the hat on his table here. I thought he was going to put it on someone's head, but he didn't. Some mysterious group, powerful group, murdered the president and framed Lee Harvey Oswald, but he didn't say who these people were. He did say the CIA covered up here. He said the FBI covered up there. In which case, if the FBI and CIA were covering up, they'd be the ones who murdered the president, right? Why doesn't Mr. Spence come right out and say it? Why doesn't he accuse the CIA and the FBI of murdering the president? There's one thing you can say about Mr. Spence. He's not a shy man. He knows how to exercise his First Amendment freedom of speech. But he doesn't say it because he's very intelligent, very wise. I'll tell you why he doesn't say it. Because he knows that if he said that the FBI murdered the president or the CIA murdered the president, it would sound downright silly. You'd laugh at him. But even though neither the CIA nor organized crime would have any productive motive whatsoever to kill the president, let's make the unwarranted assumption that they did, that they had such a motive, and let's go on and discuss Mr. Spence's next point about Ruby killing Oswald. Mafia contract killers are always selected with utmost care. I mean, the one chosen to kill Oswald would be everything that Jack Ruby was not. He'd be someone who had a long track record of effectively carrying out murder contracts before for them, and would be a precise, unemotional, businesslike, and above all, tight-lipped killer for hire. The whole notion of sophisticated groups getting, like organized crime and U.S. intelligence, getting Jack Ruby of all people to accomplish a job which, if he talked, would prove fatal to their existence is just downright laughable. When Mr. Spence argued that Oswald was just a patsy and was framed, he conveniently neglected to be specific. How was Lee Harvey Oswald framed? When we look at the mechanics of such a possible conspiracy in this case, how could he have been framed? Let's get into the mechanics. Who was this other gunman who, on the day of the assassination, made his way into the book depository building, carrying a rifle, went up to the 6th floor, shot and killed the president, made his way back down to the 1st floor, and escaped without leaving a trace? How, in fact, if Oswald were innocent, did they get Oswald within 45 minutes of the assassination to murder Officer Tippit? Or was he framed for that murder too? Mr. Spence can't have it both ways. If the people who set Oswald up were so sophisticated to come up with this incredible, elaborate conspiracy, I mean, to the point they had people, according to Mr. Spence, who can superimpose this man's head on someone else's body. And imposters down in Mexico City. If they were that bright, why weren't they intelligent enough to know the most obvious thing of all? That you don't attempt to frame a man of questionable marksmanship ability who possesses a $19 mail-order rifle. As surely as I am standing here, as surely as night follows day, Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, is responsible for the murder of President John F. Kennedy. You are 12 reasonable men and women, and that is why I have every confidence that you will confirm this fact for the pages of history by your verdict of guilty. Thank you so very much, ladies and gentlemen.
You may be seated. I have a note here which reads as follows: Your Honor, we have reached a unanimous verdict dated November 22, 1986, signed Jack Morgan, foreperson. Mr. Morgan, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
If you would, please, if you just hand it to the marshal. You may be seated.
Verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant Lee Harvey Oswald guilty of the offense charged in 1 of the indictment.
After returning a verdict of guilty, the jury was asked to consider whether Oswald had acted alone or with others. The majority concluded that he was the sole assassin.